We had just gotten a motion to approve the recommendations as amended. There was one minor modification on a conclusion. So with that, I think we're ready to vote. All those in favor? Say aye. Aye. Any oppositions? Any abstentions?
I'm going to abstain. CommScope is a SaaS provider, and I just don't think we should vote on the recommendations. So CommScope abstains.
So we'll note for the record that Mark Gibson is abstaining. Any other abstentions on the phone?
For the research. All those who abstain.
CommScope is not paying for the research.
Thank you to the Enforcement Committee and to future work for enforcement. It never seems to go away. So the final report we have to go over is the spectrum efficiency report, and who's going to be?
That is me to start, and Carolyn will get to go. So thanks everybody for all your contributions to the Spectrum Efficiency Committee. As you can see, we did not win awards for brevity in our report. We have 11 pages of text and a total of 29 pages when you include the appendices of the interviews. So we appreciate your indulgence in reviewing the more detailed report. We did have 2 questions to answer. One was the outreach and finalized recommendation. Well, this is coming out of our last meeting. To complete the outreach and finalized recommendations on the actions to improve efficiency without harming effectiveness. Carolyn had the lead on that, and then I led on the mechanisms to increase efficiency and what the barriers are. So I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn to discuss the interview process from our last meeting, and then I'll take over after that.
Sure, thanks, Brian. So we interviewed 8 federal agencies: OMB, ITS, DHS, DoD, FAA, NOAA, DOJ, and NASA, for the purpose of getting agency input, so that we had that information to consider in our recommendations in our report. And we really appreciate the participation from these agencies. We found it very valuable having them share their perspectives and their insight, and it helped us provide better, more useful recommendations. So this information was incorporated into our report, and a highlight of the interviews from the agencies are included in the appendix, as Bryan noted. And so the group, we scheduled these different interviews, met with them, had questions that we had sent, and so we followed a similar pattern with each agency to make them consistent, and found it very useful.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? So I just wanted to verify that whatever was included in the report from the agencies explicitly were reviewed and cleared by those agencies.
So all of the notes were sent to the agencies, and they were approved, or in one case, one agency didn't said that there were no issues, or we asked if there were any issues. So almost all of the interview notes are included in the report.
Explicitly for public release.
Correct.
Okay.
We also noted that in our interviews that it was for public information.
Thank you.
Excellent. I do commend those notes in the back of the report. They make for interesting reading. So we divided the rest of the report into barriers to implementing spectrum efficiency mechanisms, and then we discussed what mechanisms were most promising, and other. Very controversial about how we characterize them. I don't know if we had 11 drafts, but we had virtually the same number. Anyway.
That's the small O.
Exactly. So on the legal barriers, you would not be surprised to learn on slide 6 that Miscellaneous Receipts Act and the Deficiency Act, the terms of the Spectrum Relocation Fund and the appropriations process were all flagged as explicitly as legal barriers. There's no coincidence that they largely run along the lines of resources to the agencies to help explore sharing options in particular, and ultimately to implement technologies that would improve sharing and efficiency gains, and allow for efficiency gains. Structurally, additional NTIA authority and resources, and general staffing and resources within the agencies, and finally, whether the bang is worth the buck, as they say, in terms of additional administrative burdens that would be caused by implementing these types of sharing or efficiency regimes, and whether or not the benefits to the public would warrant those resources. And also incentivizing sort of in a principal agent problem, incentivizing the relevant actors to take those steps. On information barriers, lack of updated comprehensive data regarding federal spectrum use. This has been a challenge at various times during the spectrum management process, including in our efforts on AWS-3, and sort of trying to develop a more robust set of data that would allow for more robust assessment across bands of where sharing and efficiency gains are most likely to be achieved. And then the complexities of quantifying a monetary or economic value for for federal spectrum assets. So this is not an unfamiliar conversation to the one we had earlier about the value to the commercial side. Just as that is hard to measure and hard to prioritize, so too it is difficult to assess what the value is of spectrum in the hands of federal users, because it's often against the context of commercial use. And then finally, on barriers, high transaction costs, which runs through all of this. And then finally, a lack of trust in technology and regulatory interference resolution process, which is also not far removed from the last set of presentations, because as these sharing regimes become increasingly complex, it is increasingly important that, all parties, including federal agencies, can trust the enforcement mechanism in place. As Dale often says, no spectrum management makes any sense unless there's an enforcement component to it. And I think similarly here, that if you don't have trust that there's an enforcement mechanism, neither commercial providers nor federal spectrum users are likely to participate or embrace a sharing regime. So on mechanisms, as I mentioned, we divided them into three categories: most promising, promising, and others. These are kind of represent a blended set of possible paths, drawing on the literature and then some things that were generated by the committee itself. So you'll see and I'm not going to read the details of each of the four, and as I mentioned, our report is longer in discussing these issues, but funding, something closer to property rights for federal spectrum users, creating flexibility, which is sort of an outgrowth of two, for bidirectional spectrum exchanges or barter and swaps. So the theory being the federal government user has a swath of spectrum, sharing is possible with another federal spectrum user. They could swap with a commercial provider and get adjacencies and allow for some consolidation that allows for increased efficiencies or sharing, and the tools are not always, transaction costs associated with those tools are very high, to the extent it happens at all. And then finally, an expansion of NTIA authority and resources, because David told us to put that in there. No, just kidding. Make sure you're paying attention.
Get me in trouble?
So, because we do think the stronger the spectrum management hand of NTIA, the more likely some of these regimes would come into use, because they're the sole government entity that has a view across all federal spectrum users. So they're uniquely well positioned to identify opportunities across the bands and to execute the kinds of tools we talked about in the most promising. In addition, some promising mechanisms are listed on 11: overlay rights, spectrum scoring reform, dynamic federal spectrum secondary markets, and then an increased component of auction revenue going to federal government users. And we talked about some of although there have been improvements in the CSEA process, et cetera, they are not, at least there's a view in some of these interviews and some of the conversations with commercial entities, that there's still some work to be done on that. I will assert that the differences among the three categories was not always uniformly held by the committee. The list, what's on which of the three lists, is the result of extensive conversation and compromise, and it is not, we don't have a colored chart that dictates why things ended up on certain pages. We did have a voting mechanism, as we alluded to. We failed. We did have a voting mechanism that resulted in the initial prioritization and some follow-up changes. But in the other mechanisms, these are mechanisms that have significant barriers to implementation and may not be worth pursuing. That's as far as we got. Spectrum auditor, spectrum use rental fees, but they're still on the list. Shared use spectrum, superhighways, spectrum currency, et cetera. A lot of things that came out of some of the work of the helping.
PCAST.
Thank you, PCAST report. And then finally, the always popular but never implemented BRAC model in the last one. So those are the 4 that ended up in the other mechanisms column. So across on slide 13 and 14, we go through the 6 recommendations, explore the most promising ones first, work with Congress to explore ways to reduce barriers to more efficient more efficient federal spectrum use in a way that does not impact mission effectiveness. In terms of the national spectrum strategy, include the development of a set of guiding principles to focus on spectrum efficiency. Once the guidelines and the larger strategy in place, considering working with OMB and FAR to figure out if there's ways to reform the federal acquisition process, which has always been raised, and especially in the interviews. And Carolyn can add color to that if you want to. Continue the two-way dialogue with agencies to increase spectrum efficiency collaboratively and strategically while meeting mission objectives. And finally, should consider the findings in this report to develop a report to Congress with recommendations that could incentivize improved efficiency. That is our list. I don't know if Carolyn, and I don't know if Jennifer has joined since we started the meeting, but if Jennifer wants to add anything or Carolyn wants to add anything, or any other members of the committee.
I'll just add, so one of the insights that came from the agency interviews is the importance of mission and mission effectiveness, and they want to use spectrum more efficiently, but they are driven by meeting their mission, and it's often a matter of safety and vitally important. So I think the insights they brought is, which helped us with our recommendations, is finding an incentive or process that enables them to meet their mission while using spectrum as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, firstly, I think we need a whole new slide for Brian's caveats there on the other end.
We have to vote on the caveats, and that would not go well.
And to emphasize that point, some of the comments were mission focused. They'll do a set of requirements, look at vendors, and get the options. And if they're 2 alike, but one has a more spectrally efficient system, well, they may not actually get authorization to spend that extra money on efficiency because it's not deemed a priority. The mission is the priority. So sometimes they're withheld back from doing that purely because of an approval process to get that efficiency in there.
And just to react to that, I mean, we spent a lot of time on A11 and whether or not there was some way to modify A11 or the acquisition guidelines to make sure that the spectrum efficiency gets taken into account. There have been legislative and other efforts to do that. Based on our interviews, those have not been terribly successful. And so it remains a challenge if someone has ideas about, well, how better to have that, what seems like a very clear public interest objective, met by the acquisition process.
It's good future work. Tom?
Just a quick question, and mainly because Bryan read it so fast, I don't think anybody actually heard what he actually said.
Sorry.
On
Try
slide,
to be efficient.
well, you could do less slides.
Well, that's also true. There are fewer pages in the report.
That would be like a light speed.
Yeah, on slide 10, the second bullet where we say grant agency spectrum ownership and flexible use rights. I'm wondering if that was really intended. Are we really talking about giving someone ownership over spectrum, or is it really you just want to grant agencies flexible use rights?
That's fair, and that's, yes, that is a,
Since I don't
from a
think
legal
anybody-
perspective,
I don't
that
think
is
anybody
certainly
owns
true.
spectrum, really, so.
That's
The
a
non-lawyer tells the lawyer.
I know, it's a fair amendment. You know me, I'm just trying to get more.
It got beaten into me when I was within the government.
Yeah.
so.
Record. That's a fair amendment.
So we're striking spectrum ownership.
No, we're just
he's
ownership.
modifying ownership and-
Ownership and would be the 2 words deleted on slide 10.
Ownership and.
Spectrum
Okay.
flexibility.
And then
So it reads grant
similarly-
agencies spectrum flexible use rights. Great.
Similarly, and perhaps more importantly, in the actual report.
I think in general, you're indirectly still saying that if you're talking about giving the agencies the ability to do whatever they want with the spectrum, whether it be sublease or what have you. And I was going to just question, since you're advising us to pursue the most promising mechanisms, and that was identified as one of the most promising, to me personally, I'm not sure it would be one of the most promising because of the complexity of the use by multiple agencies in almost every band that we manage. So that's just a comment.
So
Yeah,
just
and
so I
if I-
can complete the cycle, though, I want to get Tom's amendment accurately into the report. So on page 6, it would be grant agencies instead of spectrum ownership, it would be flexible use rights for encumbered bands, including the rights to.
And then you've got property rights down.
Yeah. So okay. How about that? We'll do editorial privileges to make conforming edits. How about that for the always catch-all solution? Okay.
But I think we need to come back to Paige's point too. 'Cause
Yeah, I did.
As many of you know, that this has been a real difficult area, and having been part of PCAST, I mean, we really struggled with this in PCAST way back when, and it continues to be. The government is not like commercial side. I mean, it just is not. And
Right.
when we try to apply commercial principles into government regimes like this, it's just really, really difficult.
And I think that's noted in the report pretty.
Yeah, no, I know it's in there. I know it's in there, but it's.
Well, this would contradict it then.
It goes beyond the fact that it's noted in the report. I think it's in some cases, for me, it's prohibitively difficult. Actually, it's part of why I didn't join this group.
Now the truth is revealed.
Yeah.
I was remiss in not mentioning one of the things that we talked about in terms of the most promising and other is that test beds would be really important as part of this. So for example, just to take this one, so there may be a band where you would experiment with something that looks like this and give once again with the caveat that NTIA would have more power to manage it, where you would try a band where you gave them flexible use rights, and saw what that would entail, what that outcome would be. And maybe some bands would not be good candidates for that, and I hear you, but there may be bands that you could identify that a test bed would work. Because to the best of my knowledge, we've never tried something like that, nor have other governments around the world.
But who becomes a CEO in this case? I mean, so it's
Thanks, guys.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. In that case, congratulations, David.
That's not what this says.
Okay,
Yeah.
I've got a long list of people with comments. We've got Paul, we've got Charlotte, we've got Mark and Michael. So let's start with Paul, and I see you two next.
Okay, and this might be a misunderstanding of me, okay, of mine. Are you trying to grant, I'm just going to go back to that same statement because it's intriguing to me, is that the allocation and everybody who's in the government allocation of that, is because you used the word band, versus an assignment that is given to an organization to do a particular application. So I was kind of confused by that because those have very different ramifications within the government sphere, and maybe I'm just not knowledgeable enough to understand that there's no issue there. So if you give flexible rights to the band, or you give flexible rights to an organization who has an assignment in that band.
I should have. My understanding is the latter.
So you're going to give, so that gets to some very interesting complications. Like for instance, it's an F-15 radar band. Okay, can they have flexible rights to use it for something else? Can they let somebody else use that band? And so the question is that, so now you got a subdivision as to the F-15 radar may want to use that. They have an allocation of that, but so does some other place that actually has an allocation for radar. Okay, in that band. So what I'm trying to understand is not an allocation, an assignment. Excuse me. Let's get different differentiations here. So I'm just trying to figure out if you guys thought about that carefully as the differences between how it's being allocated, how it's being assigned, and what kind of flexibility you're actually asking for.
So, and what I should, this one in particular was drawn from the literature, and I should check my sites right here. But 14. There it is. Look at that, making waves. Harold Feld and Gregory Rose. Breaking the logs down. My understanding of how this would be characterized or done is that you would have your assignment would be translated into a property-like right for that, within the scope of that assignment. It would not be so for example, if your F-15 radar was sharing with a land mobile system, is that?
Sorry.
Yeah, it would be, each of those would get that bundle of rights. Not a full, they wouldn't get a bundle of rights beyond what their current assignment is.
Okay.
Now, that is not to say that longer term you wouldn't have something that's more flexible, but I would assume what would be the case is that you would have, let's say in that band where those two services share, is that then they would be able to, just for example, that land mobile system might then swap out with someone else to give more efficient use to the F-15 band, because maybe there's a reason that the PLR was limiting the use of that, or some other system could be put in there, and the agencies would have more flexibility with NTIA's approval to make those sorts of swaps. So you have, they become more like pieces of a puzzle, and then you could move them around more flexibly than at least the perception of the folks who brought up this idea thought there was today. Charlotte, did you have something?
Okay.
No.
All right, Charlotte, you're next on the list. Paul,
But
Okay.
No, Karen's gonna help us.
So we also noted in the report that these rights would need to be defined, and so there is more work to do. So that would be.
Yeah, I just want to, I have to read the full report then to actually
Yes.
get that. But
Well, and
I
I
think
also-
there's a huge complication there, and I just want to make sure.
Yeah, but
that we don't
I just
overstep.
not to make more excuses for the report, but we did go through
Okay,
20
Carol.
some odd possibilities of how. So to the notion that there's a lot more intellectual work to be done on all 20 would not be at all surprising to me. So the theory is just that we were trying to find categories of things that we're spending time on, and so some of the things that were more ambitious theoretically would have a greater impact, which is why they're at the front. And not everyone agreed on where things are. Obviously, Paige would like to move this one down. But I think it's a combination of how hard would it be to do and how big of an impact would it have. And that was the sort of general framework into which the categories were put, which I think was original edit from you, actually.
Did you literally do a 2x2 matrix?
Not in
There was a discussion of the matrix among the group, and then there were votes, which is an unusual CSMAC tool, but we were trying to find a way to get to consensus other than just fighting the whole time about what belonged where. So that's how we did it. We scored it based on which of the categories it fit.
Hey, I'm going to go to Paige real quick.
Just a quick follow-up. So in the description of that this can occur, but it has to be coordinated and approved by NTIA, that those thoughts are somewhat in conflict, because it's rights that they can do something else with would imply that it wouldn't be going through the normal process. So
Yeah.
just, you might want to clarify what.
Fair, and putting aside the earlier caveat that it shouldn't look like commercial, I think we are conceiving of it as like the commercial in the sense that the NTIA would serve as a traffic cop of those swaps, just as the FCC serves as the traffic cop for swaps in the commercial side. So I think that's the way it was conceived of.
And just to remind folks that the assignments on the federal side are for specific systems, purposes, geographic. So
Yeah.
any other use than that would then require a process to.
Right.
So I just want to make sure it's characterized the right way, which to me doesn't imply any kind of property rights or flexible use in the way that you're articulating it. So I asked you just to clarify what the context really is.
Charlotte.
Sure, Charlotte Rath. This is just follow-up really to Dennis's point. I think, in fact, the reason that this is in this report is for precisely the reason that Dennis said, which is that it continues to come up over and over and over again. And we talk about it, we think there might be some value to it, but what we really need to do, I feel, is work through it and in more detail. It does, when you look at the literature, it does, you look at it when people talk about it, it is something that continues to come up. And I just think that part of what we were trying to do is not necessarily saying, this is the most promising, we should just move to this system, this is going to work. But it's the most promising to move to the next step and really investigate it.
Okay.
I think Charlotte. So the next person I had was Mark McHenry.
You mentioned here the lack of data from federal spectrum use is really critical. We try to convince DoD and federal users to use advanced spectrum sharing, and we can never make the case they would get more channels. I mean, you could do your mission better, but there was no recommendation to fix your finding. You still don't leave a way for the user to say, well, if I had sharing, I could do my mission better. And the reason they can't make the calculation, there's no data. They can't go through the assignments and the sharing rules to figure out that there's value. It's like you're missing a recommendation to make the data available so people can prove that they could do their mission better if they had fancy technology.
I'm not completely sure I track what you're
Page
saying,
8,
but
you say
I think
the barrier is lack of knowledge of federal spectrum use. But I don't see any recommendation that would address that. And
I think we were trying to get at that. It was 7 about expanding NTIA authority and resources was the theory.
Which one is that?
It's in most promising.
And also continue the dialogue.
And then and also the recommendations at the end. Oh, I'm sorry. It's in two places. And Mary points out it is in the recommendations on the second one, on slide 14. I was pointing to expanding NTIA resources and authority as most promising, as one of the most promising recommendations.
I don't see it. How is it making the data available?
Well, the point is that it's not clear that the data exists, right? So
Well, no, they have assignment data, and you could ask the users how often they use the assignments. They could put together
who's the
scenarios.
they?
Well, federal
So we
users.
were making it them. We were making it NTIA.
Federal users could calculate among themselves what their usage is, and if they had a new technology, the new technology would have that many more channels available. I thought that's what your slide 8 was trying to, your first bullet on 8 was, since they can't make that calculation because they don't have the data.
Right. I guess I feel like we're arguing about where the data should sit, and I guess we're defaulting to having it sit with NTIA and having federal users access it that way. It sounds like you're more envisioning a situation where the individual federal spectrum users have access.
I don't think even DOD even knows how much spectrum they really need or use. So I think I don't see your recommendation addresses the issue.
I don't know if this addresses your issue, but on slide 14, the second recommendation is NTIA dialogue with agencies to address, plan, and implement increased spectrum efficiency collaboratively and strategically. Maybe it doesn't say the word data, but that's what NTIA would be doing, right?
They would make scenarios available so users could say, if I had the better efficient technology, I'd get more channels, I could do my mission better.
The limits of PowerPoint, yes. I think that's what it was
Yes.
intended. That's what was intended.
All right.
Did you have something?
Yeah.
I just want to make clear what you're saying. So are you saying that NTIA should be in the business of analyzing each of the spectrum systems that are being used by the federal agencies and proposing efficient alternatives?
No, you say, here's some data sets that if you want to calculate, if you had the better technology, you could get more channels and be more mission effectiveness. Here's the data, you can make the calculation, but there's no way they can get access to the data. We go to DOD program of record after record trying to say, you use better technology, you'd get more channels, and they just can't make the calculation. There's no data sets available. They can't make the calculation.
They can't make the calculation because
They don't know how many other users are out there. They don't know who they're competing with, their resources. They don't know how often other people use it. Since there's 50 other people they're competing with, they have no way to make a calculation.
I see what you're saying. You want us to surface the data to other federal users of who else is sharing the band with them.
So they could determine, is the technology useful to me or not? Right now it's a black hole.
I see what you're saying.
Wait, I think I think we may be conflating different issues. So there's a need to better understand how we define efficiency, how we assess it, how we assess trades among alternatives for same capability, as well as trades among how well we share, whether that be federal on federal or federal on non-federal. And so the data element, there is a lot of data today, whether it's as granular that we need it to be to do some of those things is another issue, and who has visibility into that data. Federal and federal may have more visibility than non-federal to federal. So I just think we're starting to conflate a couple of issues in my head, but that's just my personal opinion.
Does anybody want to respond to any of those comments?
Well, to go back to the recommendation that Mary was reading from, but it does suggest more resources to explore spectrum uses systematically and strategically to identify more spectrum efficient cross-agency solutions, address cross-agency challenges and risk, and set timelines for activity, etc. So the theory is that does capture it. So if you have a recommendation or want to alter the recommendation 5 on page 11 of the draft report, then we're all in if we're not capturing what you described. Because I think it is an interesting component of this that you've raised.
I want to think about that, Mark, and then Michael, you had the next.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael Calabrese. I just want to come back to what Paige raised before about most promising mechanisms. The number 2 and number 3, spectrum property rights and exchanges or barter swaps. I think the main problem is that it seems by the way it's worded to exclude NTIA as the coordinating mechanism. And Paige, I think, particularly mentioned, first of all, both of those are impractical because of, without that coordination by NTIA, because these bans are multi-use by many federal agencies for very divergent purposes. And so no agency by itself, can decide to make these deals. They're not necessarily aware of what all the other agencies are doing or able to coordinate or avoid problems and so on. But there's a bigger problem than that, and that's the practical problem. The policy problem is it creates band fragmentation. I mean, imagine if the Navy, and when you look at CBRS, 3550 to 3700, if the Navy had done some sort of sale, lease, swap, barter, exchange of just a bit of the spectrum, some of the spectrum in one state, at one time, it really would ruin the ability of the FCC, well, both NTIA and FCC, to coordinate anything band-wide. So you'd have this tremendous fragmentation of federal spectrum when, in fact, with coordination, you could get far greater use out of it by looking at it holistically. So I think, though, at the same time, these could be worth looking at as mechanisms, but it would have to be, I think, substituting NTIA for where it says agencies. So if you said grant NTIA spectrum flexible use rights to facilitate lease, subdivision, etc., permit NTIA and commercial users to negotiate barters or exchanges, that would preserve a NTIA statutory coordination mechanism and make sure that this was going to be done in a coordinated fashion, including with the FCC, which NTIA actively collaborates with, whereas a myriad of individual federal agencies do not. So I just want to, I just think the way it's written, it seems to exclude NTIA, where it should really emphasize that these capabilities are given to NTIA.
So I think that to Mary's point, the text more fully elucidates the role of NTIA and specifically talks about it in their actual report, so that the weaknesses of PowerPoint come back into play on how they're characterized on slide 10. Because the theme running through the entire thing is sort of a empowered NTIA, not a weakened NTIA. So I don't want to. That is the intent.
Do we want to make is there any proposed to change any of the text here? We feel like the report covers it.
I leave that to Michael, but it is specifically referenced in the spectrum property rights, and it's implicit in the bidirectional sharing section as well. And then the ultimate recommendation obviously talks about expansion of NTIA rights, or NTIA authority.
Well, can you hold a second?
Yeah, you want to try and pin it out? Yep.
We'll come back to it, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think the recommendations, it appears recommendations themselves aren't that individual agencies should have these authorities. Mm-hmm. But I just find it troublesome that we don't include some language about, with NTIA's.
You take a minute, look at it, see if you want to propose a change. I think the committee is saying they feel comfortable that the intent is reflected. Yep. And so with that, I'm going to hold you, Michael, and then Mary, you had...
I have a question actually for Carolyn about the recommendation on procurement, which I thought was really interesting. Of course, an agency at the point of procurement is procuring things that the vendors have shown up with, right? So we're pretty late in the game in terms of the technology that's been developed. Was there any indication in the interviews that agencies thought there were gaps in basic research that need to be addressed in terms of developing more spectrally efficient federal systems? And I'm aware federal systems are highly specialized, right? It's not like the commercial sector at all. But were there areas where you could back up from the procurement process and try to address efficiency that way?
Sure. So yes, more research for more spectrally efficient technologies would be helpful. But more than that, Also making sure they're reliable, because agencies don't want to take on additional risk with technologies that aren't proven. And then when you have technologies that are specific to federal systems, those can be more expensive because you don't get the economies of scale. So there's some issues like that. But yes, more research.
Okay, thank you.
Dennis, did you have a question or comment?
No, I was just going to pile on Mike's.
Before we come back to that, is there any other folks with comments, questions about the subcommittee report? Go ahead, Rick.
Just to follow up a little bit about this question. I think that the other thing that was kind of interesting from talking to the agencies was that they would be hard pressed to justify spending money on this stuff unless there was for research and stuff, unless there was a requirement to do that. In fact, they never really viewed spectral efficiency as like a prima requirement in the first place, even when they buy stuff. They certainly do contract for services and research and so forth, but I got the feeling unless there was like a strong incentive, like a mandate to go do that, they probably wouldn't do that, because they're going to pick the cheapest thing. The guy said this several times. We're going to pick the cheapest thing that meets our minimum requirement, and spectrum efficiency is usually not a part of that equation. That was kind of the whole discussion about the OMB circular, about do you use that at all? And the answer pretty much was no, not really. So I think they want to do research, but they aren't going to be incentivized to do that unless there's really a strong incentive or a mandate to go do that and make that a primary. I've said this in the RFPs that we get from our government customers. Why don't you incentivize spectrum efficiency as one of the evaluation factors for award? You know, when you actually give out contracts, and I kind of get this askance look, like what the heck's that all about? You know, we're just trying to get the link closed. You know, and so that's kind of my experience.
Thanks, Rick. All right, so we'll come back to Michael. Do you want to make any proposal? Are you comfortable?
Yeah, I think we could clarify, and I hope it's not just a case of clarifying the PowerPoint, but we'll have to carry it over, obviously, to the report.
Yeah.
Is for those most promising number 2 and 3. Spectrum property rights and exchanges or barter swaps, is we could just put at the end of each one, comma, based on the coordination and approval of NTIA. Because ultimately, NTIA would have to be involved in coordinating and ultimately approving, because they have to, in essence, it's going to be their fiduciary duty to certify this isn't mucking up anything else, right?
Since my understanding of the PowerPoint is that's not the binding thing, but the document is, I'd like to do that to the document instead, if we can, and just add in coordination with NTIA, either at we'll make conforming edits to both spectrum property rights and bidirectional spectrum exchanges, and make clear the prominent or the central NTIA role.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mind changing on the PowerPoint, but since this is the thing people act on.
No, I realize that, and I can find quickly enough how to do it in the report,
yeah,
but just the idea of based on the coordination and approval of NTIA.
Coordination and approval.
Yeah.
Sounds like we have a path there.
Friendly amendment.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, then with that, wait, we have one more question.
I haven't given up yet.
Okay. Mark?
Section 5 here in the report.
Section 5, sorry, where are you?
Recommendation 5, NTIA should continue.
Yes, 5. Yes.
The next last sentence, we put something in there that would make data available to federal users so they can calculate improved mission capacity. It's just something that one of the things they would do, you give examples here of things they could kind of do. One of them would be provide data sets to allow users to calculate how their missions would be better performed, more efficient.
So I have no idea what the implications are of that for NTIA, so I don't have any problem with editing, but I don't have anything.
I'm not sure I fully track what
Okay.
it means.
So program X said, we're interested in this technology, but we don't know who we're competing with. We don't know how many more channels we would get if we had this more efficiency. Can you help us make the calculation? That's what's lacking is they can't calculate how many more channels they would get if they had more spectrum technology.
Right.
Because they have no information on the 50 other users and anything about it. So no
Well,
one
they
can-
actually do have access to a lot of that information, but we'd be happy to work with, to see if there are additional mechanisms and information that could be provided. but they do have access to a lot of other government information as well.
So you're generally okay with?
Yeah, I mean, it's your recommendation to
Yeah.
us that we can.
Well,
take
I
into
just am a
account.
little nervous making it without knowing
Yeah.
more about what the.
I agree that there's a nervousness to the last minute. It does feel like the spirit is captured, and maybe that's something for the future to look specifically at data. But it does feel like it's pretty broad in its recommendation, as I read
Well,
it.
the last sentence says NTI should continue to collaborate with the FCC to evolve the spectrum efficiency policy. You could just say FCC and agencies. Would that?
You want the NTI should continue a constructive two-way dialogue with agencies, the first sentence, with agencies to address, plan, and implement increased spectrum efficiency collaboratively and strategically. I mean, we could put it including through data sharing, or including through data management, data sharing.
I don't think, well, I give up.
What do you think?
Through enhanced data sharing or information.
Including
I
enhanced.
don't think these programs of record can make these calculations. I sit with these guys all the time. They have no idea what they can get out of
Okay, how about
I would use
including
the word-
potentially through enhanced data sharing? How about the potentially gets you give us a way out, but it still gets in.
But it's
here.
on the record then.
Okay.
Can you read it one more time, Brian? Just so
I'll
that
do my
everybody-
bestest. I always feel like I get the reports that have all this at the end. I don't know why. Okay, NTI should continue a constructive two-way dialogue with agencies to address, plan, and implement increased spectrum efficiency collaboratively and strategically, open parens, including potentially through enhanced data sharing, close parens, while meeting mission objectives.
Okay.
That's fine.
All right. With
Need
that,
a submission.
I am
Hoorah.
hoping to get a motion to accept the report, presentation. Oh, that's the motion? Yes. As edited. Okay. The report as edited. So we have a motion from Miriam. I need a second. Andrew. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any any nays? Any abstentions? With that, it is passed, and I also want to thank this committee. It's a very impressive report. A lot of work went into. I'm impressed by all the work that went into the agencies. I found it to be a very valuable read, and I think it's great that it's going to be a public document so thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Let's give everyone a round of applause. I guess we're at the opportunity for public comment. The person that wanted to comment is no longer here. Is there any other public comment in the room? Seeing none, is there any public comment from the phone? All right, hearing none, we'll close the opportunity for public comment. So then the final thing is closing remarks. I'll make a couple of remarks. So this is my last CSMAC. I've been with the CSMAC, I think, 4 terms. So about 8 years, plus or minus things. It's been a really good experience for me. I don't consider myself really a spectrum wonk, so I've kind of learned a lot about spectrum. I've mostly learned from all of you. And the one thing I've learned is if you're ever in the role of being the chairman, there's really only one important job, and that's to have great subcommittee co-chairs and selecting those. And I think we've had really, really great co-chairs, and this has made my job, in fact, trivial. And the other good thing is to have a co-chair you're working with who does all the work, and that's Mark. So for me, it's just time for a new voice on the committee. I'll create a space for a new voice, and I look forward to the future things. But it's been great working with all of you. Rick.
And I want to thank you personally. You've been a great mentor for me during this process. Unlike you always call when I figured out what your phone number was. Changed a lot. But the person we could talk to when we were having our own little issues inside the committee, and you always had great insights to that. So I'll certainly miss you as a person. I'm sure the rest of the committee will as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mark, do you have any other questions?
I second what Rick said. I mean, I've really enjoyed the collaboration. We go back to TV Whitespace and that fun thing. Is that on the record? But I mean, it's. I think you're right. It's having the right people in the right spots, and I think this whole committee has been really overachieving. I mean, it's a committee of overachievers, so managing that's been fun. So with new leadership across the board, I think we're looking forward to the 25 subcommittees we're going to have. Once David gets this stuff together, but I think I've enjoyed it. So, and thanks for all the hard work, everyone.
Yeah, and the spirit of this committee is it's truly to try and do the right thing. You just don't see a lot of agendas. Everyone just seems like they're trying to get the best answer for the country. That's really great to see. So I really enjoyed that. And thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
And everyone should come to Paige's celebration tonight.
5:30.
Yeah,
Dave?
real quick, a couple things. I noticed you've made a few modifications to the recommendations on the report, so I'll be looking for your updates, subcommittee co-chairs.
You want the microphone so they can hear you.
Over the next couple of weeks, please. Thanks. So I can have the most up-to-date and reliable information, because from that we do draw recommendations that we then consider internally in NTIA and how to best address. So I appreciate that. And I believe Rebecca has something she wants to say too.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody, folks here know that ITS has some of our equipment out in the parking lot where the vans are out there. They have been doing demonstrations for the last 2 hours, and several folks here said, oh darn, I'm going to miss the demonstration. So the ITS staff are staying out there through the lunch hour. They'll be there until 1 o'clock. So feel free to go out and enjoy their demonstrations and ask them questions. And Frank Sanders is out there, and he's talking about radar detection also.
That's all he talks about.
And just for, there's the radar. And just for tonight, everyone is welcome, including ISART attendees, whomever. So don't limit your. Feel free to bring along a friend or whatever. So
Thank you.
It's been
it's a
passed
big
around.
tent.
It's been passed around.
Big tent.
No, we're not a tent. Sorry. Figure of speech.
NTIA's OGC has cleared it as a widely attended event.
Yeah.
We're good for government people to attend.
Cool.
Paige, you need comments?
Just last comments again, thank you. I can't express enough how much I've appreciated your input, your sage wisdom, and you've benefited all of us in the community at large. So thank you very much. I will miss all of you, but I'm sure you will have good things to do in the,
You're not
in the
inviting us
forward
to
years.
Florida?
Anytime you want to come by Sarasota, give me a call.